Cold War did not look like war. It looked like paperwork. It looked like filing cabinets and routing codes and men in suits sitting across from other men in suits, all of them speaking in the careful, flattened language of people who understood that the wrong word in the wrong room could end everything. It looked like generals reviewing contingency plans for events that were never supposed to happen, signing off on operational frameworks designed to function even if the people who built them were already dead. It looked like silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a mechanism under enormous pressure, holding, always holding, waiting for a signal that, on more than one occasion, almost came. There is a version of the Cold War that most people carry with them. It is a version that includes the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, and then a gradual unwinding that ended with a wall coming down and a flag being lowered over the Kremlin. That version is not wrong, but it is radically incomplete. It leaves out the parts that were never meant to be known, the programs that were classified not because they were embarrassing, but because their very existence implied something about the nature of the conflict that neither side was prepared to admit publicly. It leaves out the machines that were designed to make decisions without human input. It leaves out the men who disobeyed orders and, by doing so, prevented the deaths of millions. It leaves out the bombs that were dropped by accident and did not detonate only because of a single failed switch. It leaves out the submarines that nearly launched, the radar systems that mistook the moon for an incoming missile strike, and the biological weapons programs that continued long after the treaties that were supposed to end them had been signed. What follows is not a dramatization. It is a careful account of 24 real programs, real decisions, real systems, and real near disasters that defined the Cold War not as a geopolitical standoff, but as an ongoing low-frequency emergency, one that was managed not through wisdom, not through restraint, but through coincidence, mechanical failure, and the occasional act of individual conscience that was never officially acknowledged and, in several cases, was actively punished. The first thing to understand is that the Cold War began before anyone called it that. The strategic logic that would define the next 4 decades was already in motion before the last shots of the Second World War had been fired. American military planners, working in the final years of the war, had already begun developing operational frameworks for a conflict with the Soviet Union. This was not paranoia. It was institutional momentum. The machinery of war planning, once set in motion, does not stop simply because the enemy changes. And so the planning continued, quietly, in offices that were never discussed in newspapers, producing documents that would not be declassified for decades. The first project worth examining in this context is one that most Americans have never heard of, despite the fact that it shaped the fundamental architecture of American nuclear strategy for the entire Cold War. It was called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, and it was not so much a plan as it was a philosophy that held that in the event of nuclear war, the United States should not think in terms of targets. It should think in terms of obliteration. The original version of the plan, developed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, called for the simultaneous delivery of American nuclear weapons against every significant urban and industrial center in the Soviet Union, China, and the Eastern Bloc, not selectively, not proportionally. Everything all at once, in a single coordinated strike that would, in the planner's own estimate, kill approximately 600 million people in the first few hours, and produce radioactive fallout that would kill hundreds of millions more over the following weeks and months. This plan was not the product of madness. It was the product of a particular kind of bureaucratic logic, the logic of irreversibility. Once the decision to use nuclear weapons had been made, or once it had been made for you by an incoming strike, the only rational response within this framework was to ensure that your retaliation was so total, so overwhelming, that no conceivable calculus could ever make a first strike worthwhile. The problem with this logic, which the planners understood and accepted, was that it left no room for restraint. It left no room for miscalculation. It left no room for the possibility that the incoming warning might be wrong. And the warnings were wrong. This is the second thing that needs to be understood. And it needs to be understood not as an exceptional occurrence, but as a recurring feature of the system. The early warning infrastructure that both superpowers built during the Cold War was extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily unreliable. It was sophisticated because both sides invested enormous resources in building radar networks, satellite systems, and sensor arrays capable of detecting a launch within minutes of it occurring. It was unreliable because the phenomena it was designed to detect, ballistic missile launches, produced signatures that were easily confused with other things: solar flares, atmospheric anomalies, satellite reflections, equipment malfunctions, and in at least one documented case, a flock of geese. The American early warning system generated false alerts with a frequency that would seem almost comical if the stakes were not what they were. Between 1977 and 1984 alone, the North American Aerospace Defense Command recorded over 20,000 instances of what were classified as missile display conference events, situations in which the warning system indicated a possible incoming attack and required human operators to evaluate whether the threat was real. The overwhelming majority of these were immediately identified as false alarms. But not all of them were immediately identified. Some of them persisted long enough to require escalation. Some of them required the men in the decision chain to begin running through the protocols, to begin calculating response times, to begin considering whether the president needed to be notified, to begin thinking about whether the window for a retaliatory strike was closing. In June of 1980, a 46-cent computer chip failed inside the warning system at NORAD and produced a display indicating that 2 Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles were inbound toward the United States. Then the display changed and indicated 220 missiles were inbound. Then it changed again. The crews responsible for evaluating the warning had approximately 3 minutes to determine whether what they were seeing was real before the response protocols would require escalation to the National Military Command Center. The alert was passed up the chain. B-52 bombers were put on alert status. The crews responsible for launching the Minuteman missiles were notified. And then, after several minutes of extraordinarily controlled panic, someone identified the failed chip, and the alert was stood down. This was not classified as a near miss at the time. It was classified as a system anomaly. The distinction matters, because a near miss implies that something almost went wrong, and the institutional preference at every level of the American national security apparatus was to describe these events in language that minimized the sense of proximity to disaster. The men who worked inside these systems understood on a visceral level that they were constantly operating at the edge of something catastrophic. The language they were required to use when describing their work did not reflect that understanding. The Soviet side had its own version of this problem, and in some ways its version was more acute. The Soviet early warning system was built under different constraints, tighter budgets, different technological approaches, and a political culture that made it extraordinarily dangerous to report bad news. A Soviet officer who told his superiors that the warning system had generated a false alert faced a different set of professional consequences than his American counterpart. The Soviet system created incentives for silence that the American system, with all its flaws, did not quite replicate. This is the context in which the events of September 1983 need to be understood. In the early hours of September 26th, a Soviet satellite-based early warning system designated OKO, which translates roughly as I, reported that an American intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from a base in the United States and was heading towards Soviet territory. Then it reported a second launch, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. The duty officer at the Soviet command center that night was a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov. His role was to evaluate incoming warnings and report them to his superiors, who would then pass them up the chain toward the men who held the authority to authorize a retaliatory strike. The protocol was clear. The chain of command was clear. What was not clear was whether what the system was showing him was real. Petrov looked at the data. He knew that the Oko satellites were new and that their software had known issues. He knew that the Americans, if they were going to launch a first strike, would not launch 5 missiles. They would launch hundreds. He knew that the ground-based radar systems, which were supposed to provide corroborating data, were not yet showing anything. He made a decision that was not his to make. He reported the alert as a system malfunction. He did not pass it up the chain. He sat at his console for several minutes that must have felt, under the circumstances, like something close to an eternity, and waited to see whether the missiles that the system was telling him were coming would arrive. They did not arrive. The system had been fooled by an unusual alignment of sunlight reflecting off clouds in a way that the satellite sensors interpreted as a launch signature. The alert was a false alarm. Petrov was right. But Petrov's decision was not celebrated. It was not officially acknowledged for many years. He was, by some accounts, reprimanded for failing to follow proper protocol in filling out his logbooks during the incident. The Soviet system, faced with evidence that one of its officers had unilaterally decided not to report a potential incoming nuclear strike, responded by quietly reassigning him and declining to discuss the matter. What the Petrov incident illustrates, and what connects it to the larger pattern of Cold War near misses, is the fundamental tension at the heart of nuclear deterrence strategy. The entire logic of deterrence depended on the credibility of the threat. The threat was only credible if both sides believed that the other side would actually follow through on it. Following through required a chain of command that was responsive, rapid, and reliable. But a chain of command that was truly responsive, truly rapid, and truly reliable was also a chain of command that was vulnerable to exactly the kind of false alarm that Petrov encountered. The systems that made deterrence credible were the same systems that made accidental war most likely. Both superpowers understood this. Both superpowers responded to this understanding in ways that made the problem worse rather than better. The American response was to build more redundancy into the warning system and to develop more sophisticated protocols for evaluating alerts. The Soviet response was to develop a system that would remove the human element from the equation almost entirely. That system was called perimeter, though it became better known in the West by the name a journalist gave it years after its existence was first revealed: Dead Hand. The project began in the late 1970s and reached operational status sometime in the early 1980s, though the exact timeline remains partially classified. Its purpose was to solve the problem that Soviet military planners had identified as their greatest vulnerability: the possibility that an American first strike would be so successful and would move so quickly that it would destroy the Soviet leadership before they could authorize a retaliatory strike. If the leadership was dead, the logic of deterrence collapsed. The Americans would have won. Perimeter was designed to ensure that this could never happen. The system worked in its basic outline as follows: a network of sensors monitored for the seismic signals associated with nuclear detonations, for elevated radiation levels, for the disruption of communications networks, and for the absence of routine communications from the command structure. If the sensors detected a combination of these signals that matched the profile of an ongoing nuclear attack, and if the system could not establish contact with the senior leadership, and if a human operator, a single officer sitting in a hardened command post deep underground, authorized the system to proceed, then Perimeter would launch a special set of rockets. These rockets were not nuclear weapons. They were communications rockets designed to fly over Soviet territory, broadcasting launch commands to every nuclear missile in the Soviet arsenal. The missiles would then launch automatically without any further human authorization. The system was not quite fully autonomous. There was still a human in the loop, the officer in the hardened command post who had to authorize the initial activation. But that officer's role was defined in a way that made the exercise of judgment almost impossible. His instructions were not to evaluate whether the attack was real. His instructions were to evaluate whether the system had detected the conditions that triggered the protocol. If the seismic sensors had registered nuclear detonations, if communications with the command structure had been lost, and if a certain amount of time had passed, his job was to press the button. The question of whether he was in fact witnessing the aftermath of an American first strike, as opposed to a series of coincidental technical failures, was not one that his role required him to answer. The existence of perimeter was officially acknowledged by Russian officials in the 1990s, though many of its operational details remain classified. American officials, when confronted with evidence of the system's existence, responded with a combination of disbelief and alarm that seemed, given their own weapons programs, somewhat difficult to sustain. The Americans had their own version of the same logic, the concept known as launch on warning, which held that American missiles should be authorized for launch as soon as an incoming attack was detected, before the first Soviet warheads had actually detonated on American soil. The difference between launch on warning and perimeter was largely one of degree. Both systems were designed to ensure that a first strike would never be successful. Both systems did so by compressing the decision window to the point where meaningful human judgment was almost impossible. The programs that ran alongside and beneath these strategic doctrines were, in many cases, even stranger. Project MKUltra is among the most widely known of the Cold War's classified programs, partly because its exposure in the 1970s produced a series of congressional investigations, and partly because its subject matter, the use of human beings as unwitting test subjects in experiments designed to explore the possibilities of psychological manipulation, is the kind of thing that requires no dramatization to be disturbing. But the degree to which MKUltra is known has, in some ways, obscured the degree to which it was representative of a much broader pattern of institutional behavior. The program began formally in 1953 under the direction of the CIA's Office of Technical Services, though its roots lay in earlier programs, notably Project Artichoke and Project Bluebird, that had been exploring similar questions since the late 1940s. The driving concern was the same across all of these programs. The belief, based in part on observations of prisoners returned from Korea, and in part on the general paranoia of the period, that the Soviets had developed techniques for controlling human behavior that the Americans did not possess and did not understand. The fear was not irrational, given what was known about Soviet interrogation methods and about the Chinese use of psychological techniques during the Korean War. But the response to the fear, a systematic program of experimentation on human subjects, conducted without consent, using techniques ranging from hypnosis and sleep deprivation to the administration of LSD, mescaline, heroin, and barbiturates, reflected something about the institutional culture of the early CIA that the fear alone does not fully explain. The experiments were conducted in hospitals, prisons, universities, and private homes. They were conducted on mental patients, on prisoners, on soldiers, on civilians, and on CIA employees who had, in some cases, volunteered and in other cases, had not. The man most closely associated with the program's most extreme experiments was a scientist named Frank Olson, whose death in November of 1953, he fell from the window of a New York hotel room, was officially classified as a suicide and then reclassified decades later as a probable homicide. The circumstances of Olson's death have never been fully resolved. The program was officially terminated in 1973 when CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. Many of the files were destroyed, but some were not. They had been misfiled in a separate records facility and were discovered during an internal audit in 1977. The documents that survived provided a partial picture of a program that had, by its own internal evaluation, largely failed to achieve its stated objectives. The techniques that had been explored, the documents suggested, were not reliable methods of mind control. They were reliable methods of producing psychological damage. The distinction between these two things had apparently not been considered a reason to stop. The CIA's interest in chemical and biological agents was not limited to their effects on human psychology. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the American military and intelligence community maintained a series of programs designed to explore the offensive and defensive possibilities of biological weapons. The most significant of these programs was centered at Fort Detrick in Maryland, where researchers worked on pathogens including anthrax, botulinum toxin, and a range of other agents, some of which were eventually produced in quantities sufficient for military deployment. The program was officially terminated by President Nixon in 1969 and 1970, and the United States signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, committing itself never to develop, produce, or stockpile biological weapons. What the American side did not know, or more precisely what the American intelligence community knew but was unable to prove publicly, was that the Soviet Union had not terminated its own biological weapons program. It had expanded it. The Soviet program, which operated under a nominally civilian organization called Biopreparat, was one of the largest and most sophisticated biological weapons enterprises in human history. At its peak in the late 1980s, it employed approximately 60,000 scientists, engineers, and support personnel working across dozens of facilities. It produced weapons-grade versions of smallpox, plague, anthrax, tularemia, and a range of other pathogens, some of which had been specifically engineered to be resistant to known treatments. It continued operating after the Soviet Union signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1975. It continued operating after Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. It continued operating by most accounts until the early 1990s. The existence of the Soviet program became publicly known primarily through the testimony of a scientist named Ken Alibek, who had worked within Biopreparat and defected to the United States in 1992. Alibek's account, which he detailed in a book published in 1999, described a program of a scale and sophistication that far exceeded anything the American intelligence community had estimated. Among the program's achievements, according to Alibek, were the development of a weaponized form of smallpox at a time when the disease had officially been eradicated from the natural world. The last known case of naturally occurring smallpox had been reported in Somalia in 1977, and the engineering of pathogens that combined the characteristics of multiple diseases in ways that would defeat existing vaccines and treatments. The implications of this were not limited to history. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Biopreparat, or what remained of it, was formally reorganized and brought under civilian control. But the scientists who had worked in the program, tens of thousands of them, did not disappear. The knowledge they possessed did not disappear. The facilities they had worked in, many of which were located in former Soviet republics that were now independent nations with limited resources and uncertain political futures, did not disappear. The question of what had happened to the pathogens that had been produced, stockpiled, and in some cases simply left in storage facilities that were no longer being adequately secured, was one that American officials struggled to answer throughout the 1990s and into the following decade. The nuclear side of the Soviet legacy presented similar and in some ways more immediately quantifiable concerns. The Soviet Union, at the peak of its nuclear arsenal, possessed approximately 45,000 nuclear warheads. The United States, at the peak of its own arsenal, possessed approximately 32,000. The combined destructive capacity of these two arsenals was sufficient to kill every human being on the planet multiple times over, a fact that strategists had internalized so thoroughly that it had become, within the planning frameworks they used, simply a given. A background condition that shaped all further calculation without itself requiring examination. The program that most clearly illustrated the self-sustaining, self-perpetuating nature of this accumulation was the American project known as the Bomber Gap, and its successor, the Missile Gap. Not because either of these gaps actually existed, but because the process by which intelligence agencies came to believe they existed, and the strategic responses that belief generated, reveals something essential about how the Cold War worked as a system. The Bomber Gap was the belief, widespread in American military and intelligence circles in the mid-1950s, that the Soviet Union was producing long-range strategic bombers at a rate that would soon give it a decisive advantage in nuclear delivery capability. The belief was based on a genuine observation. At an air show in Moscow in 1955, Soviet aircraft flew a large formation of what appeared to be their new Bison heavy bomber past the reviewing stand. American observers counted the aircraft and reported back. The number they reported was alarming. What they had not understood, and what Soviet planners had intended them not to understand, was that the same small group of aircraft had flown past the reviewing stand multiple times, creating the impression of a much larger fleet. The American response to the bomber gap was a significant acceleration in bomber production and a massive investment in air defense infrastructure. By the time American reconnaissance satellites confirmed that the Soviet bomber fleet was substantially smaller than feared, the investments had already been made, and the institutional momentum they had generated was already in motion. The bomber gap gave way to the missile gap. The belief, equally incorrect, that the Soviet Union was producing intercontinental ballistic missiles at a rate that would soon give it a decisive first-strike capability. This belief was held with great conviction by, among others, Senator John F. Kennedy, who used it as a major theme in his 1960 presidential campaign. By the time Kennedy took office and was briefed on the actual balance of missile forces, it was clear that the gap existed primarily in the other direction. The United States had more ICBMs than the Soviet Union, not fewer. The pattern here: intelligence assessment, strategic response, escalation, revelation of the assessment's inaccuracy, and yet continuation of the strategic response because the institutional momentum it had generated could not simply be reversed, was not an aberration. It was the normal operating mode of the Cold War's military-industrial apparatus. The systems were self-sustaining. They generated the fears that justified their continued existence. They produced the assessments that produced the procurement decisions, that produced the capabilities, that produced the assessments on the other side, that produced their procurement decisions, in a cycle that had no natural stopping point and no mechanism for honest self-evaluation. The program known as Project Iceworm was a product of this same logic, and it is worth describing in some detail, both because it is relatively little known and because it illustrates, with unusual clarity, the way the Cold War's logic of deterrence could lead to projects that were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. Project Iceworm was an American military program developed in the early 1960s with the objective of constructing a network of mobile nuclear missile launch sites beneath the Greenland ice sheet. The concept was elegant in its way. The ice sheet was 2 miles thick and essentially impenetrable to Soviet nuclear weapons. The sub-ice terrain was flat and could be tunneled through relatively easily, and the missiles, if positioned under the ice, could be moved along a network of tunnels to prevent the Soviets from ever knowing exactly where they were, thus making a preemptive strike impossible. The project was expected to eventually house up to 600 medium-range ballistic missiles. The cover for the project was a facility called Camp Century, which was presented publicly as a research station for studying the Arctic environment. Camp Century was real. It was a functioning installation, complete with a nuclear reactor to power it, and it produced genuine scientific research. But its primary purpose was to test the engineering techniques that would be required for Project Iceworm. The tests revealed that the ice sheet was not, in fact, stable in the way the engineers had assumed. The ice moved. It compressed the tunnels. The infrastructure that had been built began to deform within months of its construction. Project Iceworm was quietly abandoned in 1966. Camp Century was abandoned in 1967. The Greenland government, which was at the time a Danish territory, was not informed of the nuclear reactor that had been buried under the ice. They were not informed of the low-level radioactive waste that had been left behind. They were not informed of the approximately 200,000 liters of diesel fuel, the biological waste, the chemical waste, or the equipment that had been abandoned in place. The Danish government was informed of some aspects of the project, but not all of them, and the full extent of what had been left behind did not become publicly known until 1997, when a Danish inquiry forced the American government to release relevant documents. The issue of what to do about the waste, which remains under the ice to this day, and which climate scientists have noted may eventually be exposed as the ice sheet retreats, has not been resolved. The logistical audacity of Project Iceworm was not unusual within the context of American Cold War military planning. The program known as Project Pluto was, in some respects, even more striking. Project Pluto was a program to develop a nuclear-powered cruise missile, a weapon that would be powered by an unshielded nuclear reactor and would fly at low altitude and supersonic speed across the Soviet Union, dropping hydrogen bombs as it went. The appeal of the concept was that a nuclear-powered missile would have, in theory, an essentially unlimited range. It could fly for days or weeks, covering vast distances and delivering its weapons to targets across the entire Soviet Union before, presumably, eventually crashing somewhere. The problems with the concept were numerous and were identified fairly early in the program's development. The unshielded reactor would emit intense radiation as the missile flew, making it lethal to any living thing in a wide area around its flight path. This was considered a feature as much as a flaw. The missile would, in a sense, be delivering radiation as it flew, quite apart from whatever bombs it was carrying. A second problem was that the missile would be extremely difficult to test. Testing a nuclear-powered cruise missile over American territory was obviously not possible. Testing it over the ocean would deliver a radioactive wake across international waters. The program was eventually cancelled in 1964 after significant investment, primarily because by that point the ballistic missile technology being developed by both superpowers had made low-flying cruise missiles strategically redundant. The nuclear ramjet engine that had been developed for the program was, by the engineers' own accounts, extraordinarily powerful and represented a genuine technological achievement. It was also deeply impractical for the purposes it had been designed to serve. The tendency towards solutions that were technically impressive but practically problematic was a recurring feature of Cold War weapons development. The American Navy's submarine program produced, in the early 1960s, a series of incidents that illustrated this tendency with uncomfortable clarity. The USS Scorpion, a nuclear attack submarine, sank in the Atlantic Ocean in May of 1968 under circumstances that have never been fully explained. 99 crew members were killed. The Navy's investigation concluded that the most probable cause was the accidental arming and detonation of one of the submarine's own torpedoes, but the investigation also noted significant uncertainty about this conclusion. The wreckage of the Scorpion was located at a depth of approximately 10,000 feet and has been monitored periodically since its discovery. The submarine was carrying nuclear weapons at the time of its sinking. Those weapons remain on the seafloor. The Scorpion was not the only American submarine to be lost during the Cold War. The USS Thresher sank in April of 1963, also in the Atlantic, killing 129 crew members. The Thresher was, at the time, the most advanced nuclear submarine in the American fleet, and its loss led to a comprehensive review of submarine safety procedures and a significant overhaul of the Navy's approach to deep-sea operations. The cause of the Thresher's sinking was eventually determined to have been a failure in a seawater piping system that caused flooding in the engine room, which led to a reactor shutdown, which left the submarine without power at a depth from which it could not recover. The investigation that followed identified numerous design and manufacturing deficiencies that had been present in the submarine from the time of its construction. The Soviet submarine program had a loss rate that was, by most estimates, substantially higher than the American program, though the full extent of Soviet submarine accidents remained classified for decades. The K-19 incident of 1961, in which a Soviet ballistic missile submarine suffered a catastrophic reactor cooling failure during exercises in the North Atlantic, became public knowledge only years later, when surviving crew members began speaking about it. The reactor on the K-19 came within a short time of a meltdown that would almost certainly have killed the entire crew and might, in the confusion and uncertainty of a Cold War naval exercise, have been interpreted by American forces as something other than an accident. The crew members who went into the reactor compartment to jury-rig a cooling system, knowing that the radiation doses they were receiving were almost certainly lethal, received doses that were in fact lethal. 8 of them died within a few weeks. Many others suffered severe radiation sickness and died in subsequent years. The K-19 was not the only Soviet submarine to experience serious nuclear incidents. The K-27 suffered a fatal reactor accident in 1968 that killed 9 crew members. The K-431 experienced a reactor explosion during a refueling operation in 1985 that killed 10 people and injured 49. The K-278 Komsomolets, the only Soviet submarine ever built with a titanium hull, sank in the Norwegian Sea in 1989, killing 42 crew members and leaving 2 nuclear torpedoes and a nuclear reactor on the seafloor at a depth of approximately 1,600 meters. The pattern of nuclear accidents at sea was not limited to submarines. The United States Air Force, during the period of airborne alert operations in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, maintained a program known as Operation Chrome Dome, in which B-52 bombers carrying nuclear weapons flew continuous airborne alert missions along routes designed to keep them in position to strike Soviet targets at all times. The logic was the same as the logic behind the land-based alert posture. If the bombers were already in the air, they could not be destroyed in a Soviet first strike. The consequence of maintaining this posture was that nuclear-armed aircraft were flying over and around American and Allied territory essentially continuously, and mechanical failures and accidents became, over time, inevitable. The accident at Palomares, Spain, in January of 1966 was one of the more consequential of these incidents. A B-52 on a Chrome Dome mission collided with a KC-135 refueling tanker during a mid-air refueling operation over southern Spain. Both aircraft were destroyed. 4 hydrogen bombs fell from the wreckage. 3 of them landed on or near the village of Palomares. The 4th fell into the Mediterranean Sea and took approximately 80 days to recover. None of the 4 bombs detonated with a nuclear yield, but 2 of them experienced conventional explosive detonations that scattered plutonium over a wide area of farmland around Palomares. The United States military spent several months collecting approximately 1,400 tons of contaminated soil and vegetation, which was transported back to the United States in sealed containers and buried at a disposal site in South Carolina. The cleanup was incomplete. Contamination remains in the soil around Palomares to this day. Negotiations between the United States and Spain over the responsibility for the remaining contamination and the cost of a more complete remediation have continued for decades without final resolution. A year after Palomares, a second Chrome Dome crash produced a more contained, but in some respects more alarming, incident. In January of 1968, a B-52 crashed while attempting an emergency landing at Thule Air Base in Greenland. The aircraft was carrying 4 hydrogen bombs, all of which broke apart in the fire that followed the crash and scattered nuclear material, including highly enriched uranium and plutonium, across the sea ice. The cleanup operation, conducted in extreme cold by American and Danish workers who were not always fully informed about the nature of what they were handling, recovered most of the contaminated material. It did not recover all of it. A 1995 investigation by a Danish journalist, drawing on declassified documents, determined that one of the 4 secondary stages of the weapons could not be accounted for. American officials, when asked about this discrepancy, said that all 4 weapons had been recovered. The documentation supporting this assertion has never been made fully public. Operation Chrome Dome was suspended after the Thule accident and was eventually terminated. The logic that had sustained it, that airborne alert was necessary to guarantee the survivability of the bomber force, had been overtaken by developments in missile technology and by the growing submarine fleet, which provided a more survivable and arguably more reliable deterrent capability than aircraft. But the termination of Chrome Dome did not end the broader pattern of nuclear accidents. It simply changed their character. The weapons were now stored in fixed facilities, buried in silos, loaded onto submarines. The accidents became less dramatic, but no less significant. In September of 1980, a maintenance worker at a Titan II missile silo near Damascus, Arkansas, dropped a socket wrench. The wrench fell approximately 70 feet and struck the body of the Titan II missile in a way that punctured the fuel tank. Rocket fuel began leaking into the silo. Several hours later, the fuel vapor ignited. The explosion was powerful enough to launch the warhead, a W-53 thermonuclear weapon with a yield of approximately 9 megatons, roughly 600 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, out of the silo and onto the surrounding farmland. The warhead did not detonate. One Air Force technician was killed in the explosion. 21 others were injured. The investigation that followed the Damascus accident revealed that the Titan II missile system had been known to be unsafe for years. Previous incidents at Titan II silos had involved leaks, explosions, and at least one other instance in which a warhead had been displaced without detonating. The Air Force had been aware of these problems. The process by which the awareness of problems was translated into operational changes was slow, bureaucratic, and incomplete. The missiles remained in service until 1984, when the entire Titan II force was finally retired. The question of how nuclear weapons were secured against unauthorized use, against theft, sabotage, or the unauthorized decision by a military officer to use them, was one that the American system addressed with a technology called a permissive action link, or PAL. A PAL was essentially an electronic lock on a nuclear weapon, requiring the input of a specific code before the weapon could be armed. The codes were controlled at the highest levels of the government, theoretically available only to the president and designated successors. The logic was straightforward. No matter what happened at the operational level, no matter how extreme the circumstances, no nuclear weapon could be used without explicit authorization from the political leadership. In practice, the implementation of PAL technology was delayed for years by resistance from military commanders who feared that the locks would prevent them from using nuclear weapons in circumstances where rapid response was necessary and communication with the political leadership was impossible. The resistance was, within its own logic, rational. The scenarios that the commanders were responsible for planning for included scenarios in which the political leadership had been killed in a first strike. If the president was dead and the weapons were locked, the deterrent had failed. The response to this concern, in several cases, was to implement PAL technology in a way that was, as a technical matter, largely symbolic. The early PAL systems on some American nuclear weapons used combinations that were set at the factory and were never changed. The code, in at least one well-documented case, was 8 zeros. The lock existed. The combination for the lock was known to everyone who needed to use the weapon. The security provided was theoretical. The security of nuclear weapons in the early decades of the Cold War was not merely a technical problem. It was also an institutional problem, and an institutional problem that reflected something deep about the culture of the organizations responsible for maintaining the weapons. The Air Force's Strategic Air Command, under the command of General Curtis LeMay for much of the 1950s, operated with a degree of institutional independence that would, in later years, be considered remarkable. LeMay was not simply the commander of the bomber force. He was, in a meaningful sense, the architect of American nuclear strategy during the most formative period of the Cold War, and his approach to that strategy was not one that easily accommodated civilian oversight. LeMay believed, with a consistency that never wavered throughout his career, that the fundamental purpose of the military was to win wars. He believed that the way to win a nuclear war was to strike first, strike hard, and strike comprehensively. He believed that the political and diplomatic processes that surrounded the decision to use nuclear weapons were obstacles to effective military action. And he acted on these beliefs in ways that, on several occasions, brought him into direct conflict with civilian leadership. During the Berlin crisis of 1961, LeMay argued for military action that the Kennedy administration had explicitly decided against. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, his recommendations were consistently more aggressive than what the political leadership was prepared to authorize. He believed and said that the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis was a defeat for the United States. Whether LeMay would have taken unilateral action, whether he would have ordered the use of nuclear weapons without explicit presidential authorization, is a question that has been debated by historians and is not definitively answerable. What is clear is that the system he commanded was structured in ways that made unilateral action at least theoretically possible. The pre-delegation arrangements that governed American nuclear weapons used during the 1950s and into the 1960s gave field commanders significant authority to use nuclear weapons in circumstances where communication with higher authority was impossible. The exact extent of this authority was, and remains, classified. But the authority existed, and it existed in a form that meant that the decision to initiate nuclear war was not exclusively held by the civilian leadership. The Soviet system had its own version of this problem, and its version was shaped by a political culture that was, in some respects, even more conducive to the kind of dangerous autonomy that the American system struggled with. The Soviet military operated with a degree of independence from civilian oversight that reflected the particular character of Soviet political authority. An authority that was, at its core, the authority of the Communist Party, rather than the authority of any individual or any democratic institution. The relationship between the party leadership and the military was complex, deeply political, and frequently adversarial. The military's access to nuclear weapons and its authority to use them in various circumstances was a matter of ongoing negotiation between institutions that did not fully trust each other. This dynamic played out in particularly acute form during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which remains the single event most commonly cited as the closest the Cold War came to actual nuclear war. The broad outlines of the crisis are widely known. The discovery of Soviet missile installations in Cuba in October of 1962, the Kennedy administration's response, the naval blockade, the communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and the eventual resolution that involved the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba and, in a less publicized arrangement, the eventual withdrawal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. But the events that came closest to producing an actual nuclear exchange were not the ones that happened at the level of Kennedy and Khrushchev. They happened at a much lower level, in circumstances where neither leader had full awareness of what was occurring. On October 27, 1962, the day that has come to be known among historians of the crisis as Black Saturday, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The decision to fire on the aircraft was made at the local command level without authorization from Moscow. It was precisely the kind of independent action that both sides had reason to fear, because it was exactly the kind of incident that could escalate beyond anyone's control. On the same day, another American U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over the Siberian peninsula of Chukotka, prompting Soviet interceptors to scramble and American fighters in Alaska to arm nuclear weapons and take off to escort the U-2 back to safety. The confrontation did not lead to shooting. It came close. Also on Black Saturday, a Soviet submarine, designated B-59, one of 4 Foxtrot-class submarines that had been sent to the Caribbean in connection with the crisis, was located by American anti-submarine forces and subjected to a sustained harassment operation involving practice depth charges dropped to signal the submarine to surface. The submarine had been out of communication with Moscow for several days. The crew did not know whether war had already started. The heat inside the submarine, which had been running submerged for an extended period, was extreme. Temperatures in some compartments had reached over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The pressure on the crew was intense. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, made the decision to arm the submarine's nuclear torpedo. The weapon had a yield estimated at approximately 10 kilotons. He ordered it prepared for firing. The reason the torpedo was not fired was a procedural anomaly. Soviet submarine doctrine at the time required that the use of nuclear weapons be authorized by both the captain and the political officer aboard the vessel. The political officer on B-59, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed with the captain that the weapon should be fired. But B-59 was part of a 4-submarine flotilla, and the flotilla's commander, Vasily Arkhipov, happened to be aboard B-59. Under the protocols that governed the flotilla's operations, Arkhipov's authorization was also required. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. He argued, in the face of considerable pressure from the captain and the political officer, that surfacing and attempting to communicate with Moscow was the correct course of action. Eventually, the captain agreed. The submarine surfaced. The nuclear torpedo was not fired. Arkhipov's decision was not the product of any particular moral framework or strategic calculation. It was the product of exhaustion, of uncertainty, and of a procedural disagreement about who had the authority to do what. The circumstances that had created the situation, the decision to send nuclear-armed submarines to the Caribbean without adequate communication systems, the decision to subject them to a harassment operation without understanding that they might be at the edge of their operational tolerances, the decision-making cultures on both sides that allowed field commanders to make nuclear weapons decisions without full information, were not addressed by the outcome. The torpedo was not fired. The crisis ended. The systems that had produced the crisis continued operating. The American signals intelligence programs that ran throughout the Cold War were, in their way, a parallel universe to the weapons programs, equally expensive, equally secret, and with consequences that were equally difficult to fully account for. The National Security Agency, which was established in 1952 and whose existence was not officially acknowledged by the government for many years, journalists sometimes called it no such agency, operated a collection infrastructure of staggering scale. At its peak, the NSA employed more mathematicians than any other organization in the world. It intercepted communications across every medium and from virtually every nation. Its facilities around the world, listening posts, satellite ground stations, undersea cable taps, represented an investment of resources that dwarfed most of the other programs of the Cold War era. The program known as Operation Ivy Bells was among the more technically audacious of the NSA's Cold War collection efforts. Beginning in the early 1970s, American submarines operating in the Sea of Okhotsk off the Soviet Pacific coast would periodically approach a Soviet underwater communications cable that ran between the Kamchatka Peninsula and the Soviet Far East mainland. Divers from the submarines would attach recording devices to the cable, devices that were designed to capture Soviet military communications and store them until the submarines returned to collect the recordings. The operation produced significant intelligence over the course of approximately a decade. It was compromised in 1980 by a former NSA employee named Ronald Pelton, who sold information about the program to Soviet intelligence. The Soviets located the recording devices but chose initially not to remove them, presumably in the hope of determining what the Americans were learning from them and of feeding disinformation through the channel. The Pelton case was one of a series of significant intelligence compromises during the Cold War that illustrated the vulnerability of even the most carefully guarded programs to human betrayal. The Walker spy ring, which operated from the mid-1960s until its exposure in 1985, sold the Soviet Union cryptographic information that gave Soviet intelligence access to a significant portion of American naval communications over a period of nearly 2 decades. The damage assessment conducted after the ring's exposure suggested that the Soviets had been able to read American naval communications, including communications about submarine operations and nuclear weapons, for a sustained period. The assessment of how much this had affected the balance of the Cold War, how much it had altered Soviet operational planning, how much it had influenced Soviet weapons development decisions, was never made public in full. The counterintelligence culture that developed within the CIA in response to concerns about Soviet penetration produced in the 1950s and 1960s one of the more remarkable institutional pathologies of the Cold War. James Angleton, who served as the CIA's chief of counterintelligence from 1954 to 1974, became convinced during the 1960s that the Soviet intelligence services had achieved a level of penetration of the CIA that rendered much of the agency's intelligence product unreliable. His concern was not irrational. Soviet intelligence had in fact achieved significant penetrations of Western intelligence services over the years, as the cases of the Cambridge Five in Britain and various lesser-known penetrations in the United States demonstrated. But Angleton's response to this concern, a sustained years-long investigation of virtually every Soviet defector and a significant number of CIA officers based on a theory of Soviet deception that became increasingly elaborate and increasingly unfalsifiable, produced consequences that were, in some ways, worse than the penetrations he was trying to uncover. The theory that Angleton developed, with input from a Soviet defector named Anatoly Golitsyn, held that Soviet intelligence had carefully staged the appearance of a Sino-Soviet split, had carefully managed a series of defectors to mislead Western intelligence, and had achieved a level of control over the flow of information reaching Western intelligence services that made almost any piece of intelligence of Soviet origin suspect. The theory was not entirely wrong. Soviet intelligence did engage in sophisticated deception operations, did manage defectors, and did attempt to influence Western intelligence assessments. But the theory was applied so broadly and with such disregard for evidence that contradicted it, that it effectively paralyzed the CIA's ability to recruit and exploit Soviet sources for a period of years. Defectors who brought genuine and valuable intelligence were subjected to years of harsh interrogation and were accused of being Soviet plants. CIA officers who questioned Angleton's methods were themselves suspected of being Soviet agents. The institutional damage was significant and long-lasting. The program known as Project Azorian, which was sometimes confused with or conflated with the cover name Project Jennifer, was a more straightforward illustration of Cold War operational ambition, and it remains one of the more remarkable engineering achievements of the entire conflict. In March of 1968, a Soviet submarine designated K-129 sank in the Pacific Ocean approximately 1,600 miles northwest of Hawaii, under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The Soviet Union launched a search for the submarine, but was unable to locate it. American hydrophone networks, which were designed to detect submarine activity, had tracked the sounds of what appeared to be an implosion, consistent with a submarine's pressure hull failing at depth. The Americans knew approximately where the submarine was. They chose not to tell the Soviets. Instead, the CIA and the Navy developed a plan to raise the submarine from the seafloor. The K-129 was lying at a depth of approximately 17,000 feet, far beyond the reach of any existing salvage technology. The project that was designed to solve this problem involved the construction of what was presented publicly as a deep-sea mining vessel, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, which was ostensibly built for industrialist Howard Hughes as part of a commercial deep-sea mining venture. The cover story was, under the circumstances, remarkably effective. The ship was actually built to lower a specialized claw mechanism to the seafloor and attempt to lift the entire submarine, or as much of it as could be recovered, to the surface. The engineering challenges involved were immense. The project cost approximately $800 million in 1970s dollars. The recovery operation, conducted in 1974, was only partially successful. The claw mechanism reached the submarine and began lifting it, but at some point during the ascent, a significant portion of the submarine's hull broke apart and fell back to the seafloor. The portion that was recovered, approximately the forward third of the submarine, was brought aboard the Glomar Explorer and examined. The examination reportedly produced nuclear torpedo designs, code materials, and other intelligence of significant value. The fate of the crew members whose bodies were recovered was handled with a degree of care that was unusual for an operation of this kind. They were given a formal burial at sea, filmed for posterity, and the film was eventually shared with the Russian government after the Cold War ended. The project was compromised in 1975 when burglars broke into a Hughes Corporation facility in Los Angeles and stole documents related to the Glomar Explorer's true purpose. The documents were offered to Los Angeles newspapers. The newspapers agreed not to publish the information at the request of CIA Director William Colby. Then the syndicated columnist Jack Anderson published a column describing the project in general terms, and the story became public. The CIA's response to press inquiries about the project produced one of the Cold War's more durable bureaucratic formulations. The agency declined to confirm or deny the existence of the project. This approach, the neither confirm nor deny policy that became known as the Glomar response, has been used by American intelligence agencies in response to sensitive inquiries ever since. The human intelligence programs that the CIA ran against the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War produced results that were, by any objective measure, mixed. The CIA's record in recruiting Soviet citizens as agents was not strong. The KGB's record in penetrating Western intelligence services was considerably better, but the technical collection programs, the satellite photography, the signals intelligence, the various overhead reconnaissance efforts, produced a more consistent stream of information about Soviet capabilities, and it was these programs that most directly shaped American strategic assessments and procurement decisions. The U-2 reconnaissance aircraft program, which produced the incident most widely associated with Cold War aerial espionage, the shootdown of Francis Gary Powers' aircraft over Sverdlovsk in May of 1960, was in some respects the least technically advanced of the major Cold War reconnaissance efforts. By the time Powers was shot down, a satellite-based reconnaissance program designated Corona was already in development and was within months of achieving its first successful imagery return. The Corona satellites, which operated under the cover of a scientific research program called Discoverer, eventually produced photographic coverage of the Soviet Union at a resolution that allowed analysts to identify specific buildings and military installations from orbit. The program ran from 1959 to 1972 and produced imagery that fundamentally changed the American intelligence community's ability to assess Soviet military capabilities. The transition from aircraft to satellites for strategic reconnaissance was not simply a technological transition, it was a legal and political transition as well, because the principle of freedom of overflight in space, the idea that a satellite passing over a foreign country's territory was not violating that country's sovereignty in the way that an aircraft clearly was not established by treaty or by international law. It was established essentially by mutual acceptance of a situation that both sides found, on balance, more useful than the alternative. The Soviets could have challenged the principle of freedom of overflight in space. They did not, because their own satellite reconnaissance programs, once they were developed, depended on exactly the same principle. The acceptance of mutual reconnaissance from space was, in its way, one of the more stable and rational arrangements of the Cold War, an implicit agreement that had the effect of reducing the risk of miscalculation by ensuring that both sides had some degree of visibility into the other's military preparations. The intelligence that these programs produced was not always used wisely. The estimates of Soviet military capability that informed American procurement decisions were frequently wrong in ways that produced unnecessary escalation. But the existence of the programs provided a floor beneath the cycle of paranoia and miscalculation, a floor that was lower than it might have been in a world of complete strategic opacity. The arms control framework that developed alongside the reconnaissance programs was an attempt to build on this floor, to institutionalize the stabilizing effects of mutual transparency, and to create legal constraints on the most dangerous aspects of the arms race. The process began with the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which moved nuclear testing underground and reduced the environmental damage from atmospheric tests without fundamentally altering the development trajectories of either side's weapons programs. It continued with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, which was designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to additional countries and which succeeded to a degree that was significant but incomplete. It produced the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks and eventually the SALT-I Agreement of 1972, which placed numerical limits on certain categories of strategic weapons for the first time. The SALT process was not, in any straightforward sense, a success. The agreements that were reached did not reduce the number of nuclear weapons. They placed ceilings on certain delivery systems while leaving other categories unconstrained, and both sides found ways to maintain and, in some cases, increase their effective strategic capabilities while remaining within the agreed limits. The Multiple Independently Targetable Re-Entry Vehicle, or MIRV, technology that allowed a single missile to carry multiple warheads aimed at different targets, was developed by both sides and was not limited by the SALT agreements. The result was that the total number of nuclear warheads continued to increase throughout the period of arms control negotiations. What the arms control process did achieve was a regularization of the relationship between the two superpowers, a set of formal mechanisms for communication and negotiation that provided channels for managing crises and reducing the risk of the kind of miscalculation that could produce catastrophic results. The hotline between Washington and Moscow, established after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, was one of these mechanisms. It was not a telephone. It was initially a teletype system, later upgraded to satellite communications, and it was used on a number of occasions during subsequent crises, including the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, to communicate directly between the two governments at moments of elevated tension. The existence of these communication channels did not, however, address the fundamental problem that had been identified by the architects of perimeter and the proponents of launch on warning. The problem that in a genuine nuclear crisis, the time available for decision-making might be measured in minutes. The hotline was useful for managing the kind of slow-moving crisis that unfolded over days or weeks, as the Cuban Missile Crisis had. It was not useful for managing the kind of crisis that would unfold if a warning system indicated an incoming missile strike. The response time in that scenario was defined by physics, not diplomacy. The program known as Able Archer 83 brought this problem into sharp relief in a way that was not fully understood at the time it occurred. Able Archer 83 was a NATO military exercise conducted in November of 1983, designed to simulate the procedures for the use of nuclear weapons in a European conflict. The exercise was realistic. It involved the participation of actual political leaders, used actual communications channels, and simulated the actual decision-making processes that would be followed in a genuine nuclear crisis. Its realism was, from the NATO perspective, its primary virtue. From the Soviet perspective, Able Archer 83 looked like something quite different. Soviet intelligence had been tracking NATO exercises for years and had developed a protocol, designated Ryan, for monitoring indicators that might suggest an imminent NATO attack. The indicators that Ryan monitored included changes in communications patterns, increases in troop movements, changes in the operational status of nuclear forces, and the participation of political leaders in military exercises. Able Archer 83 triggered a significant number of these indicators. Soviet intelligence assessed with a degree of concern that senior American officials did not understand until years later, when a KGB defector named Oleg Gordievsky provided the relevant documents that the exercise might be a cover for an actual attack. The Soviet response to Able Archer 83 included the preparation of nuclear-capable aircraft in Eastern Europe for possible immediate use. It included heightened alert status for Soviet nuclear forces. It included what appears, based on the available evidence, to have been genuine institutional fear at senior levels of the Soviet military and intelligence apparatus. The exercise was eventually concluded without incident, and the Soviet alert was stood down. American officials, when they learned the full extent of the Soviet reaction, primarily through Gordievsky's reporting, were shaken by the degree to which the two sides had apparently been simultaneously in a state of elevated alert without being aware of it. The episode illustrated something that the architects of NATO military strategy had not fully accounted for: the possibility that the routines and exercises designed to maintain readiness might themselves be perceived by the other side as threatening in a way that could trigger the very escalation that the readiness was supposed to deter. The problem was not malice. It was the structure of a system in which both sides were constantly monitoring each other's behavior for signs of an imminent attack, and in which the preparations for war and the preparations for deterring war were, from the outside, essentially indistinguishable. The environmental dimension of the Cold War's weapons programs was one that received relatively little attention during the conflict itself, and has received only somewhat more attention since. The nuclear testing programs conducted by both superpowers, and eventually by other nuclear-armed states, released substantial quantities of radioactive material into the atmosphere, the soil, and the ocean. The American testing program in the Marshall Islands, which began in 1946 with Operation Crossroads and continued through the 1950s, exposed the populations of several inhabited atolls to radiation levels that have had documented long-term health consequences. The residents of Bikini Atoll were relocated before the testing began. They were told at the time that their relocation was temporary, that they would be able to return once the testing was complete. They have not returned. The atoll remains contaminated. The hydrogen bomb test conducted by the United States in March of 1954, designated Castle Bravo, produced a yield that was substantially larger than the designers had predicted, approximately 15 megatons rather than the expected 6 megatons, and spread radioactive fallout across a much larger area than had been anticipated. The crew of a Japanese fishing vessel, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was outside the officially designated exclusion zone when the test occurred and was exposed to significant levels of fallout. The ship's radio operator died several months later from radiation sickness. The incident created a significant diplomatic crisis between the United States and Japan and contributed to the growing international movement against nuclear testing. The Soviet testing program, centered primarily at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan and at Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic, exposed populations in the vicinity to levels of radiation that were, in some cases, comparable to or exceeding those experienced by people in the vicinity of the American tests in the Pacific. The communities near Semipalatinsk, which was known internally as the Polygon, experienced elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, and other radiation-related health conditions that Soviet authorities documented but did not publicize. The full extent of the health consequences became better understood only after the Soviet Union's collapse allowed researchers access to previously classified records. The Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated, was tested by the Soviet Union over Novaya Zemlya in October of 1961. Its yield has been estimated at approximately 50 to 58 megatons, more than 3,000 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The fireball was approximately 8 kilometers in diameter. The blast wave was detected by monitoring stations around the world and circled the globe 3 times. The weapon was developed not because it had any particular strategic utility. A weapon of that size is not meaningfully more useful as a military instrument than a weapon 1/10 its size, but because its development and testing was a statement. It was an expression of capability directed at an audience that understood what it meant. The American response to the Tsar Bomba was not to develop an equally large weapon. The United States had already conducted tests of comparable yield and had concluded that the military utility of weapons above a certain size was minimal, but to continue refining the efficiency and reliability of its existing arsenal and to continue developing the delivery systems that would ensure the weapons could reach their targets. The submarine-launched ballistic missile program, which had begun in the late 1950s with the Polaris missile, produced by the mid-1960s a sea-based deterrent force that was, from a strategic standpoint, nearly invulnerable. The submarines carrying the missiles could not be tracked reliably with existing technology. They could patrol indefinitely. They could fire from essentially any ocean on the planet. They represented the most stable element of the strategic balance, the part of the nuclear force that was, by its nature, most resistant to a first strike. The stability of the submarine force was not purely a technical achievement. It was also, in part, a product of the tacit rules that both superpowers developed over the course of the Cold War for the behavior of their naval forces. Rules that were never formally codified, but were generally understood and generally observed. The Incidents at Sea Agreement of 1972, which established procedures for preventing dangerous encounters between American and Soviet naval vessels, was the most formal expression of these rules. But the agreement was built on a foundation of informal understandings that had developed over years of close and sometimes dangerous naval encounters. The close proximity operations that both navies conducted, the practice of trailing submarines, the game of cat and mouse that American and Soviet submarine crews played in the depths of the world's oceans, produced their own set of near misses and accidents. The exact number of underwater collisions between American and Soviet submarines during the Cold War is not publicly known. It is known to have been more than one and is believed, based on available evidence, to have been considerably more than that. Each collision carried the risk of escalation, the risk that a submarine crew, uncertain whether it had been deliberately rammed or had experienced a mechanical failure, would react in a way that produced a larger confrontation. The institutional response to these risks, on both sides, was the development of procedures and protocols that were designed to ensure that accidental encounters did not escalate. The procedures were imperfect. The protocols were sometimes violated. The accidents kept happening. But the framework within which they happened was one that both sides had, implicitly, agreed to treat as a domain of manageable risk rather than a domain of existential threat. The understanding that submarine collisions were not acts of war, that aerial interceptions were not necessarily hostile acts, that provocations and counter-provocations were part of a game rather than the opening moves of a conflict. This understanding was never written down and was never formally agreed to. It was simply a shared behavioral reality that developed over time and that, on the available evidence, substantially reduced the risk that any individual incident would produce a war. The program known as the Farewell Dossier illustrated from a different angle how the Cold War's parallel systems of deception and counter-deception operated at the level of technology transfer. In the early 1980s, French intelligence provided the CIA with a collection of documents obtained from a KGB officer who had agreed to cooperate with Western intelligence. The documents, which became known as the Farewell Dossier after the code name given to the source, provided detailed information about the Soviet Union's systematic effort to acquire Western technology through a combination of espionage, corporate infiltration, and commercial transactions. The documents revealed that the Soviet Union had been obtaining significant quantities of technology relevant to its military and industrial programs, computer equipment, machine tools, sensors, and various other items, through channels that had not been adequately monitored by Western export control systems. The American response to this information, as later described by officials involved in the decision, was not simply to tighten export controls. It was to use the knowledge of Soviet acquisition channels to feed the Soviets technology that had been deliberately modified to fail. The most dramatic account of this approach involves the Soviet acquisition of software for controlling a natural gas pipeline. Software that had been allowed to reach the Soviets through a channel that had been identified in the farewell documents, but that had been modified to contain logic that would cause the pipeline control system to malfunction in a catastrophic way after a period of normal operation. In 1982, by this account, a Soviet natural gas pipeline in Siberia exploded. The explosion was observed by American surveillance satellites and was recorded as one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. Whether the explosion was caused by the sabotaged software or by other factors remains a matter of some dispute among the people who were involved. The Farewell Dossier operation illustrated the degree to which the Cold War was fought, not just with weapons and intelligence, but with the infrastructure of industrial society. Both sides understood that technological advantage was a fundamental component of strategic capability, and both sides invested enormously in acquiring, protecting, and in some cases, deliberately degrading the other side's technological base. The Soviet program of technology acquisition was, for much of the Cold War, significantly more systematic and successful than American officials acknowledged publicly. The Western response to it, when it was fully mounted, was correspondingly aggressive. The spy satellite programs that both sides operated, the intelligence networks that both sides ran, the technical collection programs that consumed enormous resources on both sides, all of these were expressions of the same fundamental reality, that the Cold War was, at its core, a competition for information. The side that knew more about the other side's capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities was the side that could plan more effectively, deter more credibly, and make better decisions in moments of crisis. The competition for information was relentless, and it produced a degree of mutual transparency that was, paradoxically, both the Cold War's most stabilizing feature and one of its most dangerous. Stabilizing because it reduced the risk of catastrophic miscalculation. Dangerous because the information it produced was frequently used to justify escalation rather than restraint. The defector programs that both sides ran were a central component of this information competition, and they produced some of the Cold War's most significant intelligence coups. The American handling of Soviet defectors, the process of debriefing them, evaluating their information, protecting them, and in some cases using them as channels for feeding disinformation back to Moscow, was one of the CIA's primary functions throughout the Cold War. The Soviet handling of American and Allied defectors and of the agents they recruited followed parallel patterns. The case of Aldrich Ames, who served as a CIA officer and Soviet agent from 1985 until his arrest in 1994, illustrates the scale of damage that a well-placed penetration could cause. Ames provided Soviet intelligence with the identities of virtually every CIA asset operating in the Soviet Union at the time he began his cooperation. Most of those assets were arrested and executed. The intelligence collection capability that the CIA had built in the Soviet Union over years of patient work was effectively destroyed within a period of months. The CIA continued to produce intelligence reports on Soviet affairs for years after Ames's betrayal, in most cases without being aware that the sources underlying those reports had been compromised or eliminated. The FBI counterintelligence program, which ran parallel to the CIA's activities and was responsible for identifying Soviet intelligence operations on American soil, produced its own significant failure in the form of Robert Hanssen, an FBI agent who provided intelligence to Soviet and later Russian intelligence from 1979 until his arrest in 2001. Hanssen's case was significant not only for the volume and sensitivity of the information he provided, which included details of American nuclear war plans, technical capabilities of American intelligence collection systems, and the identities of Soviet assets who were providing information to American intelligence, but also for what it revealed about the FBI's internal security culture. Despite multiple indicators of his guilt that appeared over the years, Hanssen was not identified as the source of the compromises he was causing until 2001. The civil defense programs that both superpowers maintained throughout the Cold War were, in their way, a mirror image of the offensive programs. A reflection of the same logic of anticipation and preparation applied to the problem of surviving rather than inflicting nuclear war. The American Civil Defense Program, which operated under various organizational structures throughout the Cold War, represented an attempt to persuade the American public that a nuclear war was survivable and that preparation could meaningfully reduce casualties. The effort produced a large body of public guidance: the duck and cover exercises, the fallout shelter programs, the emergency broadcasting systems, that has been widely remembered and widely mocked, often without full appreciation of the institutional seriousness with which it was pursued. The Soviet civil defense program was, by most assessments, more extensive than the American program. It involved larger investments in hardened facilities, more systematic training of the civilian population, and a more credible effort to actually implement the preparations that planning called for. Whether this difference in civil defense investment reflected a genuine difference in willingness to contemplate fighting a nuclear war, or simply a difference in political culture and in the relationship between the military and the civilian population, is a question that historians have not resolved. The hardened underground facilities that both sides built during the Cold War represent perhaps the most literal expression of the Cold War's logic. The Soviet program of constructing hardened command facilities, bunkers designed to allow the senior political and military leadership to survive a nuclear strike and continue exercising command authority, was extensive. The facilities were built at multiple locations around Moscow and at other sites throughout the Soviet Union. They were connected by a network of hardened communications links designed to function after a nuclear strike had disrupted surface communications. The depth of the deepest facilities and the number of people they were designed to accommodate reflected a genuine belief that the senior leadership could survive a nuclear war and that the exercise of leadership after a nuclear exchange was a meaningful concept. The American equivalent, the continuity of government programs that provided for the evacuation of senior officials and the establishment of alternate command authority in the event of a nuclear attack, was similarly extensive and similarly based on the assumption that something like normal government function could be maintained after a nuclear exchange. The Mount Weather facility in Virginia, the Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, and various other sites were constructed and maintained for this purpose throughout the Cold War. The assumption embedded in these facilities, the assumption that what would exist after a nuclear war would be something that could be governed, that the chain of command would retain meaning after the destruction of everything the chain of command was designed to protect, was never seriously examined as a planning assumption. It was simply built into the infrastructure. The environmental monitoring programs that developed from the Cold War's nuclear testing era eventually produced a global network of sensors designed to detect nuclear tests anywhere on Earth. A network that became the foundation of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty's verification regime. The scientific understanding of the global atmosphere, the oceans, and the Earth's geology that developed partly from the need to monitor nuclear testing has been, from a purely scientific perspective, one of the Cold War's more benign legacies. The seismographic networks, the atmospheric sampling programs, the hydroacoustic monitoring systems, these were built for military purposes and have been repurposed for scientific ones. The communications satellite programs that both sides developed in the 1960s and 1970s followed a similar pattern. Built initially for military purposes, including for nuclear command and control, they became the foundation of the global telecommunications infrastructure. The Internet itself traces its conceptual origins to ARPANET, which was developed in the late 1960s with Defense Department funding and with the specific design requirement that it be able to continue functioning if portions of it were destroyed, a requirement that reflected the nuclear war planning context in which it was conceived. The distributed architecture that makes the Internet resilient to attacks was designed in its original formulation for resilience against nuclear strikes. The economic dimension of the Cold War arms race is one that does not fully emerge from any account of individual programs, but that shaped everything about how both sides approached the competition. The Soviet Union spent a proportion of its gross domestic product on defense that was, by most estimates, substantially larger than the American proportion. Some estimates suggest it was 2 or 3 times larger. The strain that this placed on the Soviet economy was not immediately visible from outside, because the Soviet system of economic statistics was not designed to make this kind of comparison easy, and because Soviet officials had strong incentives not to publicize information that would reveal the extent to which military spending was crowding out civilian production. The Reagan administration's decision to accelerate American defense spending in the early 1980s was, at least partly, a deliberate attempt to exploit this vulnerability, to force the Soviet Union to match an American buildup that the American economy could sustain more easily than the Soviet economy could. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announced by President Reagan in March of 1983, fit into this logic whether or not it was intended to. A serious American effort to build a missile defense system would require an enormous investment and a Soviet effort to counter it, either by building its own missile defense system or by developing enough offensive missiles to overwhelm any defensive system the Americans might build, would require an equally enormous investment. The Soviets had neither the economic resources to match the investment nor the technological base to develop an equivalent system quickly. Whether the SDI program was the primary factor in the Soviet Union's eventual collapse is a question that historians debate because the Soviet collapse had many causes, and the relationship between military spending and economic decline was complex and mediated by many other factors. What is not in serious dispute is that the Soviet economy was under severe stress by the mid-1980s, that the combination of military spending and structural economic inefficiency was producing a crisis that the political leadership was struggling to address, and that the reform programs initiated by Gorbachev in response to this crisis, glasnost and perestroika, unleashed political forces that accelerated rather than arrested the Union's disintegration. The arms control negotiations that characterized the late 1980s, the INF Treaty of 1987, which eliminated an entire class of intermediate-range nuclear missiles from Europe, and the START negotiations that produced the first strategic arms reduction agreement in 1991 represented a genuine reduction in the nuclear threat, achieved through genuine political will on both sides. The weapons that were eliminated were actually destroyed. The verification procedures were, by the standards of previous arms control agreements, unusually robust. The agreements represented something new in the Cold War's history, not simply a cap on further growth, but an actual reversal. They also represented something that was, from a historical perspective, worth noting. The weapons were being eliminated. The systems that had produced the weapons, the laboratories, the design bureaus, the industrial complexes, the doctrinal frameworks, the planning cultures, the command structures, were not being eliminated. They were being maintained at reduced scale against the possibility that the agreements might not hold, that the political situation might change, that the weapons might once again be needed. The institutional momentum that had built the arsenals was not dismantled along with the missiles. It was preserved in a lower energy state, waiting. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 25, 1991, when Mikhail Gorbachev resigned and the flag over the Kremlin was replaced. The nuclear weapons that had been the primary instrument and the primary purpose of the Cold War were distributed across 4 newly independent states: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The command and control systems for those weapons were not cleanly distributed. The personnel who had operated those weapons did not, in all cases, remain with those weapons. The security of the weapons during the transition period was a matter of profound concern to American officials, who launched a series of programs designed to help the successor states secure and eventually eliminate their inherited nuclear arsenals. The programs worked in the sense that the weapons were eventually consolidated under Russian control, and that Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan eventually relinquished their inherited arsenals. They worked imperfectly, in the sense that the transition period produced a degree of weapons security uncertainty that has never been fully audited. They did not work at all, in the sense that they could not address what had not been destroyed: the knowledge, the institutional capacity, the strategic frameworks, the doctrines, the deeply embedded reflexes of a conflict that had shaped every major institution of both superpowers for 4 decades. The nuclear arsenals that remained at the Cold War's end were smaller than they had been at the Cold War's peak. They were still larger than anything that could be used without consequences that would extend far beyond any conceivable political objective. The early warning systems that had generated hundreds of false alarms during the Cold War continued to operate. The protocols for responding to those alarms continued to compress the decision window to the point where meaningful human judgment was difficult. The command and control systems that had been designed to function without leadership continued to exist, maintained and updated, in the hardened facilities beneath the Russian countryside and the American heartland. The submarines continued to patrol, carrying their weapons on trajectories that could reach any city on the surface of the planet within 30 minutes of receiving the order. The conflict that had organized the world for 4 decades ended. The infrastructure of that conflict did not end with it. The silos remained. The submarines remained. The warning systems remained. The plans remained. The habits of institutional thought that had produced all of it remained, distributed across thousands of individuals who had spent their careers inside the system and who carried its logic with them into whatever came next. The Cold War concluded without resolving the question it had spent 40 years posing. The question of what human institutions do when they build systems capable of ending everything and then find that they cannot agree on whether to take them apart.